Shabbat Shalom. This is Larry Mitchell with Friends of Israel. We are continuing our verse-by-verse study through the Apocalypse, and today we are going to do the introduction to the Church of Ephesus. Jesus' messages to the seven churches. In Revelation 2, verse 1, we read, "To the angel of the Church of Ephesus write." J. Vernon McGee, through the Bible, describes Ephesus this way. Ephesus was a city of about 200,000 people. It was a great city and had a huge outdoor theater which could seat about 20,000 people. It was a place of resorts, and the Roman emperors came there. It was a city constructed of white marble, a beautiful place. And Paul commented on that. If we think that the impact of the gospel was not great in that area, we are entirely mistaken. Such was the impact of the gospel on Ephesus that 4 great pillars or towers were placed at the entrance of the harbor, and upon them was the emblem of the cross. One monument was dedicated to Matthew, one to Mark, one to Luke, and one to John. Only one pillar stands there today, but it still bears the symbol of the cross. And there are other evidences of the tremendous impact of the gospel where pagan temples were later turned into churches. Now, the church at Ephesus was founded by the Apostle Paul. We read about that in Acts chapter 18 to 28. So Paul still remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow. And he came to Ephesus and left him there. But he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay a longer time with them, he did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, "I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing." And he sailed from Ephesus, and when he had landed at Caesarea and gone up and greeted the church, he went down to Antioch. And after he spent some time there, he departed and went over the region of Galatia and Pergama in order to strengthen all the disciples. Now a certain Jew named Apollos, born in Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, though he knew only the baptism of John. So he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Aquila and Priscilla heard them, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he desired to cross to Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting disciples to receive him when he arrived. He greatly helped those who believed through grace, for he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, showing from the scriptures that Jesus is the Christ, or the Messiah. Now after Paul had left Ephesus, he sent Timothy to be the pastor. 1 Timothy 1:3. As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, remain in Ephesus, that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine. Notice what the Ephesus was when Paul wrote to Timothy. Make sure that the Christians in Ephesus do not teach false doctrine. We'll see in a moment the reason he gave that exhortation was Paul knew that there were going to be false prophets arising in Ephesus. But to find out a little bit more about Timothy, I'm going to be quoting from an article, Who Was Timothy in the Bible, and How Did He Help Paul, by Dan Graves. When St. Paul returned from Rome in 64 AD, he left Timothy at Ephesus to take care of the church, of which he was the first bishop, as he was recognized by the Council of Chalcedon. After Timothy had visited Paul at Rome, he returned to Ephesus, where he continued to govern the church as bishop without the least interruption for considerable time, until at length he fell a victim to the malice of the pagans, who were his greatest enemies. The pagan people made a great feast in a celebration which they carried in possession the images of their idols, being all masked and armed with clubs and other offensive weapons. Timothy, seeing the procession, was so irritated at their idolatry and superstition, they rushed in among them in order to stop their proceedings, upon which they immediately fell upon him, and with clubs beat him so unmerciful in a manner that he soon died. They left his body on the spot where they murdered him, which was removed thence by some of his disciples, and decently interred on the top of a mountain at a small distance from the city. The Apostle John would become the pastor of Ephesus, and he was exiled to Patmos, where he wrote the Apocalypse, and would return after his exile, spending his last days pastoring the church at Ephesus. When John wrote this portion of the Revelation, he was actually writing to his home church. From an article, BiblePath.com, the Apostle John, we read, the Apostle John rose to a position of influence within the worldwide Christianity, and shortly before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD, he moved to Ephesus in modern-day Turkey. He became the pastor of the church at Ephesus and a special relationship with other churches in the area, as we now know from the letters to the 7 churches in Asia in the book of the Revelation. While in Ephesus, by order of the Roman Emperor Domitian, John was exiled to the island called Patmos, in what is known as the Cave of the Apocalypse, located on the island. The sacred text of the book of the Revelation was given to the Apostle John by Jesus. It was here that John recorded was written in the New Testament book of Revelation. When he was released from exile, he returned to Ephesus and lived till the time of the Roman Emperor Trajan. Paul was very concerned that false prophets would infiltrate the church at Ephesus. Acts 20:29 and 30. For I know this, that after my departure savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Also from among yourselves men will rise up, speaking perverse things, to draw away the disciples after themselves. It would appear that the church at Ephesus heeded the Apostle Paul's warning, at least until the time John was writing Revelation. They zealously protected their church against false teachings, but in order to protect their doctrine, they had lost their first love. They were so zealous in protecting doctrine, they lost their first love. Revelation 2, verse 2 says, I know your works, your labor, your patience, that you cannot bear those who are evil, and you have tested those who say they are apostles and are not, and have found them liars. In Revelation 2:4, nevertheless I have this against you, that you left your first love. The church at Ephesus was built upon 3 giants of the faith: the Apostle Paul, Timothy, and John. And although they were very doctrinally sound, they still lost their first love. You know, there's a real danger that when a church becomes overly zealous to weed out heresy and are doctrinally sound, they can lose their first love. The letter to the Church of Ephesus warns Bible-believing fundamental churches, watch out lest you lose your first love. This is Larry Mitchell. Shabbat Shalom.